Welcome to the Centennial Month for the Department of Epidemiology. I am going to keep this very brief because we got a fantastic speaker and panel coming. And so I think many of you will know our principal speaker quite well, John Samet. John was the chairman of our department from, God, I got to figure this out now, 94 to 2008. So I can do it. And he is a man who needs little introduction. He is currently the chair of the Department of Preventive Medicine at the University of Southern California. When I think about who the public health heroes of the 20th century are, clearly Abel Woolman has to be one for cleaning up the water supply. I think Sue Baker is also one for having developed the entire field of injury control. And every time you go by an exit off the highway and you see those barrels, you thank Sue for that. She saved countless lives. And then John Samet. And today he's going to give you a brief talk about how little epidemiology took on big tobacco. So I will, at this point, John will introduce his panel afterwards. We have mics at the corners. We are recording this session, so if you have a question later on for the panel or for John, please use the microphones. Thank you.
Thanks, David, for that very nice introduction. It's actually really nice to come back to Baltimore and to Johns Hopkins and feel like I'm come back to one of my homes. It's actually 7 years since I left for California, thinking that life would be different, and it is. When I left, I was given this cartoon by Kay Dickerson. Hey, what can I say? It's not Baltimore, but then what is? And of course, prophetically, this cartoon worked. I cannot imagine how many times I was asked after moving to LA, what do you like better, LA or Baltimore? Ponder that. Maybe we can talk about that during the question and answer series. But of course, both have their wonderful parts and their amazingly challenging parts. It's nice to come back to the department. I see that it continues to be well led by Nancy and Roberta, and that things continue on as always. It's also a shock to come back and see people who I think of as just entering their PhDs as full professors. Time has gone by, and it's really nice to see the successes of everyone who started here 20 years or more ago. I'm pleased to be here celebrating the 100th anniversary. This 100 years corresponds roughly to what Alan Brandt called the cigarette century. And it was over that 100 years, roughly, that we saw the rise of the tobacco epidemic, and beginning 50 years ago, the decline of consumption. I'm going to sort of anchor my talk around those 100 years and what happened. It's also not the only anniversary. So here's Joe Camel, or Camel, at 100 years, 1913 to 2013. So you might think about something like this. And over that century, there has been a remarkable run, of course, of smoking attributable death. So many 100th anniversaries. Now, this is the rise and fall of cigarette consumption in the United States. At its peak, there were approximately 200 packs, that's 4,000 cigarettes, smoked per adult per year, counting smokers and non-smokers alike. Some of us remember the days when people actually could smoke 2 packs of cigarettes a day. And you need a lot of burn time to do that. And in our society now, it's not so easy to do that. But along the way, there were many important events, some shown on here in the text, that led to the rise and also later to the fall of consumption. Many of those events related to the findings of epidemiological research. And I'm going to focus in on three: the identification of smoking as a cause of cancer, and lung cancer in particular; the passive smoking story, which really has changed our society; and then the low tar story, which was a very important part of the federal case against the tobacco industry. So here's our chart. And here is a plot of lung cancer mortality in men. That's the red line. See it going up? Say yes. Okay. So if you were an Epi 1 class, the next question I would ask you is, what would you do? What would you do if you were sitting there in 1950? And of course, the right answer today would be, I'd do an epidemiological study. And way to go. But the first part of this was sorting out, in fact, whether the rise was real. And then people turning to think about what the causes might have been. That thinking began actually earlier than roughly mid-century, when people think of the first wave of studies. There were studies done perhaps as early as the early 30s by Hoffman. And then later in the Nazi German era, there were several case control studies done. A departmental graduate and now the editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Public Health, Alfredo Moravia, wrote about who did the first study, and I was asked to comment on this a year or two ago. I actually don't know why anybody would care who did the first study about 80 or 90 years later, but it seemed to be important to Alfredo. So since he thought Hoffman did the first study, I just politely said maybe not. But here's this paper from 1931 with a roughly case control-like design. And then, of course, important study, 1939, Mueller in Germany, published, again, a case control-like study. But in terms of epidemiology, there were a few other landmarks. So this is a paper from Raymond Pearl. There'll be a little quiz in a moment. These are survival curves. And families in East Baltimore, even in the 30s, a 10-year difference in life expectancy, heavy smokers versus non-smokers. Now here's the question. Who was Raymond Pearl? Who in the room knows who Raymond Pearl was? Are some of you being shy? Is it so few? Who was Raymond Pearl?
First chair of vital statistics and biometry.
So he's the chair of biostatistics here, among other things. Yes, correct. And he was quite a remarkable man. Before word processing, he published over 700 papers and multiple books. This was probably also pre-lithium. But he was extraordinarily productive. I do think that the next question should have been, if there's such a difference in life expectancy, why is there one? And interestingly, I've never been able to find that he moved on to that next question. But many will point to 1950 because there was a wave, actually 5 case control studies on smoking and lung cancer published that year. Now, some of the names are familiar. Levin, of course, became a member of this department. Winder did his paper as a medical student. Graham was a thoracic surgeon who was the first to remove a lung for lung cancer. And then Dahl and Hill, of course, were the famous British epidemiologist, statistician. These studies were incredibly successful. And the reason lies in the power of smoking as a cause of lung cancer, the absence of many other causes, and the ability to easily obtain a history of smoking. Do you smoke? How many? What age did you start? Do you still smoke? And there was actually a time even we could ask those questions and people told the truth. That's a bit of a complication at this point. But these studies were clear, and I think, again, this is one of sort of the proofs of principle that the epidemiological method worked. Now, once these studies were done, there was a need to understand how strong the association was. And actually, these studies were published with simple chi-squares because the odds ratio was not described in 1950. That was to come in 1951 with another important Hopkins figure, Jerry Kornfeld, who published this paper in 1951. And one of his examples was case control data from a study published in 1950 showing that you could calculate the strength of association using the odds ratio, which he described there. Now, the other thing you would like to know if something causes a disease is how much disease is caused by that exposure. And that issue was addressed in a 1953 paper by Levin, who was a member of the faculty here in this department. This is a picture of the faculty of the Department of Epidemiology. You may have seen this before. I really like this picture because everybody is so well dressed compared to now. And even the department chair doesn't have a tie on today. And times change. So there it is. And the first woman in the department was Miriam Brawley, who worked on TB with Frost, among other things. But Levin described the attributable risk in this paper. And we still use that. And the principle he described of disease estimation is widely used. And I think he actually does not get the credit he should have had for this discovery or parameter. Now, the evidence mounted from 50 on. Winder went on to show that painting the backs of mice with tobacco tar caused cancer, caused tumors. The first cohort studies were done here, one by Kyler Hammond and Dan Horn, predecessors of the American Cancer Society cohorts. And Dahl and Hill did their study of British doctors. It was an amazing accomplishment. They enrolled 32,000 British doctors in 1951. And in 1954, they published their first paper before computers. So everybody who's procrastinating on their dissertation, you just don't have an excuse. So here was their data. They were very convincing in showing this association of smoking with cancer. And here's Dahl later commenting on the power of smoking as a cause of disease. And in his later years, he really became very much sort of a science advocate for doing something in tobacco control. Now, what would a responsible industry do if they were told that their products were killing people? Well, they'd find a way to say, of course, that the products aren't killing people. And that's where the tobacco industry began its campaign. I will say that even as early as the paper by Pearl, there were possibly industry people putting out spin on the paper in 1938. But the real story begins in 1953 with a meeting of the industry's leaders and council at the Plaza Hotel in New York. We have ample documentation of this now through access to the industry's documents. So at this meeting, the strategy of collusion was hatched that continued, of course, for decades and was outed through review of the documents and in many of the court cases, including the Department of Justice case, which we'll hear about. They published in all newspapers something called the Frank Statement that said that they were after the truth and they would not lie to the public and so on. And of course, they did. This story is nicely captured in Robert Proctor's book. Robert, a historian at Stanford, who has used the documents to tell the story of what the industry did. The painting is by Van Gogh, by the way. So he was on to something long before the epidemiological studies. Their strategies were numerous. One of them was to say that there was no animal model for smoking and disease. This is one of my favorite cartoons. These studies are inconclusive. So far, we've only succeeded in giving cancer and heart disease to laboratory humans. And for the several lawyers in the room, you may appreciate that what do you do when you run out of humans? You start using lawyers. So what was done then was to say, well, we need to put the evidence together. The evidence mounted over the 50s. There was the biological evidence. There was the epidemiological evidence. There was the coherence of rising smoking and rising chronic diseases. And in one of the first papers that was a systematic-like review, again with two important Hopkins authors, the lung cancer story was looked at. This was a paper in the JNCI in 59. Another important link was Leroy Burney, Surgeon General during the 50s, who published statements in 57 and 59 moving towards smoking as a cause of lung cancer. And there's still here, I think, an annual Burney lecture. So the evidence mounted, and then the important need was to say, does smoking cause cancer? Does smoking cause lung cancer, laryngeal cancer, COPD? And we had ways in epidemiology of thinking about causation grounded in the infectious disease paradigm, the Henley-Koch postulates. And they didn't fit well with the new evidence and the observational evidence, the possibility that there were problems of bias of different sorts. And if you read the literature of the 50s and into the 60s, there was a lot of tension in the field and discussion that extended beyond. And of course, the stakes were big. So people wrote important papers about causation. This is one that is often quoted, probably still read by students here, that has this famous quote that I like about the need to move on and do things even when the scientific evidence is incomplete. A very handy and always applicable quote when we have public health problems. Also very important was the 1964 Surgeon General's report that proposed criteria for causality. Again, still taught, still used in practice, guidelines. And if you were to look at what regulatory agencies say in the United States and elsewhere, you will find that these ideas very much live on. So the 64 Surgeon General's report stands as an important landmark in the field of epidemiology. The idea that we're going to bring together all the evidence, review it, weigh what is there against the hypothesis of interest, smoking as a cause of disease, and plausible alternatives. So here is that report available online. Here is the press conference with Surgeon General Terry and the committee behind him. Here is the team that put together the reports. I'll comment that while I was here, I was senior editor for the 2004 and 2006 Surgeon General's reports, assisted by Charlotte Gerzak, who's in the audience, and others. And these were major team efforts. And here's Terry in his report. Now, here's the committee. So just admire the ashtrays. This was a committee that was considered to be neutral on the problem of smoking and disease. Oops, I can't point. This man, Louis Fieser, was my organic chemistry professor at Harvard. I had him in his last of 37 years of teaching Chem 20. And he had a set of 3x5 cards that he wrote across the board, erased the board, and then wrote more 3x5 cards. Now, here's another small question for you. Who was Len Schumann? Any takers on Len Schumann? Moises knows.
Yeah, he was the head of epidemiology at the University of Minnesota.
So he was the head of epidemiology at Minnesota. He was the epidemiologist on the committee. Okay, so Len was an important figure, as were others on the committee. Now, I've proposed that this is among the first systematic reviews in public health. They reviewed over 7,500 papers. They had a plan. They looked at the validity of individual studies and had criteria for reaching conclusions and made the story transparent, which I think is why it's held up so well. They did what we might call a meta-analysis. This table pools the results of 7 cohort studies. And when we published the 2014 report, the 50th anniversary, someone took the same data and produced a forest plot. So here is a representation of a meta-analysis likely done by Cochrane, who was a member of the committee. Now the key findings are here, and I just want to lay out this. The way the report worked is they said, here's the things that smoking causes. And then they said, this is something important enough that we should take remedial action. So again, and this is this sort of divide that remains in epidemiology. Are we providers of evidence to those who take action? Are we providers of evidence and decision makers and action takers? And I think around the field you'll get a range of views about what we do. But here is a good starting point on that. And then of course, newspaper accounts, cigarettes peril health, immediate action. And then here's our friends in the industry. Cigarette sales continue to rise. Professor Green at Yale, I'm going to keep on smoking. No evidence. Statistical analysis has to be interpreted. We know from the documents that he was well paid by the industry to say such things. So this was the aftermath, a little bit more. And then, of course, funding research. And here's Governor Sanford from North Carolina. And then the Congress split, and of course, the tobacco industry had a great deal of power. Here's a comment from Clarence Cook Little, who was the first scientific director of the Tobacco Industry Research Committee. An interesting man. He started the Jackson Labs. He was president of the University of Maine by age 30 or so, University of Michigan, and was involved in the founding of the American Cancer Society, and then recruited by the industry. So 50 years later, where are we on the health story? Well, this is a chart from the 50th anniversary report, and the red indicates new causal associations. So remarkable to me was that 50 years after the first report, we were still finding new causal links to active smoking. Important things: immune function, ectopic pregnancy, diabetes, tuberculosis, and actually nailing down, finally, male sexual functioning as associated with, causally associated with smoking. Actually, chapter written by colleagues across the street in urology. Now, I want to move on to another important area for epidemiology, passive smoking. Now, for historical reference, to give you a feel, this is me in medical school. At the time, I was wearing those glasses that everyone wore, and there's something different about the hair color. Now, again, to talk about how times have changed, my colleague here, who I leave unnamed, we were good college friends and good medical school friends. Sadly, she was one of only 2 women in a class of 70. And here she is sitting in a classroom in her white clothes, and you might notice what that is. She's smoking. So the norms have changed, and I'm sure 30 or 40 years ago, I know there was smoking in this building, and certainly no one, not even a dean, would light up a cigarette now in this building. So the world has changed, and again, I think epidemiology was critical here. The tobacco industry feared nothing more than health effects of secondhand smoke. This is one of the documents talking about the consequences for business of workplace smoking restrictions. Of course, people wouldn't smoke as much, and of course, they would find it easier to quit if they worked in smoke-free places. Leading the parade of studies was Hirayama's cohort study in Japan, which showed higher rates of lung cancer in non-smoking women married to smokers compared to non-smoking women married to non-smokers. Got it? Okay, that's the yellow. Okay, that's the yellow. Okay, so this was an important finding. It was vigorously attacked, but it was replicated. And by 1986, we have the 86 Surgeon General's report. Let me go back with Everett Koop. I was one of the editors of that report, and this is our team going to visit Everett Koop at his home on the NIH campus. And here is the report and the data on secondhand smoke from the time. This chapter is actually written by Anna Wu, who's one of my faculty members at USC. And given the evidence of increased risk in the epidemiological studies and what we knew, it was appropriate and supported to reach the conclusion that secondhand smoke increased risk for lung cancer in never smokers. Now, what followed was the most aggressive campaign to create doubt that I think the industry ever undertook. There have been a number of great books on these efforts and how they've spread into other domains. This book by Oreskes and Conway, I think, is probably the best. And for those of you who don't read books, here's a movie. And the movie is great. A lot of it is about the tobacco story. And interestingly, some of the same people who were tobacco deniers were climate change deniers. well paid, I'm sure, on both accounts. But the playbook for doubt creation dates back to that 1953 meeting at the Plaza Hotel. Now, what did they say? So here, for example, statistical problems in Hirayama's studies. Who's saying that? Nathan Mantell, a leading figure. Many of you know, of course, his work, well paid by the industry. Studies were done to try and discredit the exposure side of the report. There's a long, tortuous history behind this particular study of tobacco-commissioned research. A major effort to infiltrate the WHO study on secondhand smoke and cancer that actually led to a panel review led by David Kessler of the industry's efforts with the WHO. Ragnar Rylander, a researcher in Sweden, secret go-between between the US tobacco industry and European toxicology, making a lot of money for this, here caught out for fraudulent data. Diminishing the entire science enterprise. Junk Science, a website supported by tobacco and others. I'm a frequent, or was a frequent appearer on this site. Johns Hopkins, it's sort of a badge of honor to have appeared on this website. Attacking entire methods of analysis, meta-analysis, here attacked in 3 papers in the peer-reviewed literature with support from the tobacco industry. Why? Because EPA did a meta-analysis in its 1992 risk assessment of secondhand smoke and lung cancer. One unfortunate episode, the Center for Indoor Air Research, housed here in Baltimore, and one that many people were not immune to their funding, again tied to the tobacco industry. If the industry didn't like what panels said about secondhand smoke, they could put together their own panels. And guess what? Their own panel in 1996 concluded that secondhand smoke did not cause lung cancer. Hiring people to travel around the world and spread the message of doubt. Asia being an important place to do that. But the evidence held up. It withstood attacks. In 2006, as I mentioned, we did a very large report on secondhand smoke. The Surgeon General then was Richard Carmona. And here is a line from his preface, basically saying that there's consensus. And I think the debate stopped with the 2006 report. And I was very pleased to see it literally being used within days in state legislatures to force a move to smoke-free environments. So here's from the 2014 report, and we've added stroke. So just one more victory of epidemiology, and we'll be moving on to the panel. The idea that healthier cigarettes could be produced, that light and low tar could make an important difference to risk. As the studies were published in the 1950s, the industry put filters on cigarettes. These filters were made of different sorts of materials with the goal of filtering out so-called tar. The cigarette itself is a highly engineered device, and in fact, it was designed in certain ways to trick the machines that collected the tar and nicotine for measurement, so that what was measured by the machine had little, if anything, to do with what entered the lungs of smokers. This is an ad from one of the early filters, the Kent Micronite filters. I have no idea. Kent, the one cigarette that can show you proof of greater health protection, which I think if you're being protected against health, doesn't that mean that you're getting diseased? I don't know. It's just so. But this was a wonderful filter. It was made of it had asbestos in it, and for those of you who know the story, it had the worst kind of asbestos in it, crucidolite asbestos. So here's some of these kinds of advertisements, and of course the question was: is there anything better, healthier? Does light mean healthier? Does mild mean healthier? Does smooth mean healthier? Well, the answer turns out to be no. And these are data from different cohort studies looking at, this is the rates for lung cancer in women and men, 3 successive cohorts going from the earliest at the bottom. You can see the increasing rates of lung cancer, and the risks of lung cancer and some other diseases, in fact, went up over time when we would have expected them to go down if these products were really making a difference. Report after report after report concluded that these products carry no less risk, and the epidemiological evidence indicated perhaps more, and we'll come back again to the importance of this in litigation around the U.S. Judge Kessler in the federal case looked at this as one of the issue, and here's her, I think, very powerful words about the industry, coming now after 40 years of epidemiological research that provide so much proof about the dangers of smoking. Minnesota, where I testified, Scott Ziegler testified, the epidemiological evidence, the econometric analysis, and others supporting what was a massive settlement for that state. The role of epidemiologists, in part in this litigation, was to be experts. And the few times I've ventured into a courtroom, it was being an expert in these tobacco trials. I learned, in fact, from these trials that partnerships with the legal profession can be very, very important. I love this quote about this is an epidemiologist, in case you can't tell. Mainly, he testified in the endless tobacco liability trials, trying to confuse juries with erudite Kissingerian, that's Henry, by the way, accented epidemiological juju about selection bias and multivariate regressions. Watch how you talk. So 5 decades of progress shown here, the ups, the downs, what has made a difference. Smoking causes lung cancer, coming in here, the 64 report, the move to clean indoor air, lights and low tars, higher taxes, and so on. So you can get the full story in the 2014 report. Now, just a few last words. I'm going to turn to the future, quote that will be known to many of you in the room. So let's just spend a minute there. 2009, the passage of the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act, creating, among other things, the Center for Tobacco Products, and Ben Apelberg, a member of our panel, works there. So this is a huge move to evidence-based regulation of tobacco products in the United States, epidemiology having an important role. The Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, the world's first global public health treaty with an evidence-based package of interventions accompanying it. And again, epidemiology playing an important role in deciding what works and tracking the global epidemic through the Global Adult Tobacco Survey. And then, of course, the evil empire continues and continues and continues. So now we have electronic cigarettes. This imagery should remind everyone of Virginia Slim's ads 30 years ago, advertising to particular racial and ethnic groups, cool cigarettes and African Americans. Sex, I guess that's what that is, shown here. Believe me, I have some more explicit ads, but I didn't think I could show them here. And then this, okay, with sort of the basic point about being able to use these anywhere. Plain packaging, Australia pioneering this, the tobacco industry fighting back using international trade law and intellectual property agreements. Uruguay, where you can only have one kind of Marlboro and not 24, like here. Again, being Uruguay fighting the tobacco industry, actually with support from Bloomberg, who has agreed to help countries in their fight against the power, might, and lawyers of the tobacco industry. So coming back in a way to this building, Michael Bloomberg, with support also from Gates, has had a tremendous role internationally in supporting implementation of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control and global tobacco control. And we'll be hearing from Yolonda Richardson from the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, which is an important partner in this initiative, as is the School of Public Health through the Institute for Global Tobacco Control. So I've talked fast, but I've met my own personal goal here. 60 slides in 30 minutes of PR. So I want to go on to introduce our panel. I've got one or two words up here for each of them, and maybe they could all come up now while I'm introducing them. Ben Apelberg, who reminded me that he came to the department in 1998. 1998. So he was once young and came here. Actually, Ben came here out of college as a master's student, got his degree, went off and worked, and then came back for his PhD. And he is, come on up, Ben, branch chief of epidemiology at the Center for Tobacco Products. Yolonda Richardson, an attorney with the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, and a key person there in their broad scope of activities, both domestically and internationally. Josh Sharfstein, who probably many of you know already, actually first met Josh when he came to Baltimore as health commissioner, and we forged a partnership that placed a faculty member, Caroline Fichtenberg, in the health department, and his path intersected with tobacco when he took on the role of deputy commissioner at the FDA. Last, Sharon Eubanks. Oh, there you are. Okay. Sharon Eubanks, attorney, lead attorney in the Department of Justice case, and I worked closely with Sharon for several years. Hers says bad acts. Now, that's actually nothing personal. It's the name of her book about her experience in the DOJ litigation and its aftermath. I actually could have put Sharon, I could have put shoes. Because Sharon is actually one of the world's largest shoe collectors. And most of our discussions about legal cases began with what new pair of shoes she might have purchased and her encouragement of Connie to go find shoes somewhere. So that's the panel. And as you can see, there's personal stakes in each one of them. Now, what we're going to do is hear from them all and then go to your questions. So think about what you would like to ask or comment on about this story and the role of epidemiology. So I think, let me start with Ben as the epidemiologist on the panel.
Sure, well, it's great to be back. I can't remember the last time I was here. I left in 2010, but it's great to see so many of familiar faces. I wanted to just pick up on the thread that John talked about, obviously, around FDA tobacco product regulation, because obviously there's the whole history that John laid out of the epidemiologic evidence to linking smoking to the many diseases, passive smoking, and the impacts of tobacco control policies. But we're still really early on in the history of tobacco product regulation. It's just with the passage of the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act in 2009 that FDA Center for Tobacco Products was formed. And that law really does give FDA some broad regulatory authorities over the marketing, manufacture, and distribution of tobacco products. So it includes authorities such as setting tobacco product standards, mandating reductions in constituents to either reduce appeal of products, toxicity, addiction of tobacco products. There's authorities over health warnings, new health warnings on tobacco products. Companies now can't just put a new product on the market without first going through an application process. And but one of the key features of FDA product regulation is that, unlike other parts of FDA, who use the safety and efficacy standard, that doesn't really apply in the case of tobacco. I mean, these are inherently harmful products. So what the law lays out is a population health approach, which is to say that any action that the agency takes, whether it's authorizing a new product on the market or promulgating some new rule, we need to consider basically the impacts to the population, the impacts to users, whether their risks might change, whether they might switch to other products, the impacts to non-users, including youth, including former tobacco product users. So it really, as you could probably guess, leads to a really important role for epidemiology in those kinds of assessments. So I just kind of wanted to get it out there that although, as John talked about, we're at the beginning of the end, there's still a whole new chapter that's being written with federal tobacco product regulation. There's still many critical questions yet to be addressed by epidemiology.
How big is your group?
Right now gosh, that's a good question. We're only about 12, 13 maybe in the Epi branch. But we're continuing to hire the branch, the office, the center continues to grow and will grow for the next few years at least.
Okay, so see Ben for a job afterwards. Josh, I think maybe we'll go to you, and I think maybe if you could speak to this, I guess, from the perspective of particularly, you've been at the local and national levels, a user of epidemiological evidence involved in tobacco, and say a little bit about how you have used the evidence.
Sure. I would also say that my whole introduction to the field of public health came from the epidemiology of tobacco. When I was a medical student, I did a rotation at the FDA when it was in the process of regulating tobacco, and they asked me on my second day there to look at, I think, what was a 300-page submission from the tobacco industry with 500 footnotes arguing that nicotine was not addictive. And I was a medical student, and they said, can you help us respond to that? And one thing I will say about tobacco epidemiologists is that they are very generous people, because I knew nothing about epidemiology or tobacco, and I called around, talked to people, and wound up writing and working with people to write the response to that. Was really my introduction to public health and to tobacco, and to what I think is the premise of today, which is that you can look at a lot of bluster from any place, and you can pierce through that. They distorted every single study, what epidemiology is a tool to find truth and to argue, and eventually you can pierce through that. And part of that is looking at data. Part of that is the good strategic use of policy, lawsuits, and other things. I'll give you an example from when I was a health commissioner. We were involved a little bit in a number of different tobacco projects, but one of them was about fire-safe cigarettes, which, for a long time, again, fiercely resisted, impossible. Finally, it came out, and there was a law, a couple states might have had them, and there was a law that passed in Maryland, which was sort of like in 3 years or something like that. So way in the distance, we'll have them in Maryland. And they drafted the law such that it only became they tried to preempt it, but the law won't preempt any localities in Maryland from enacting fire safety standards before the 3 years. But the way they wrote it was the preemption didn't take effect until the law took effect, which was 3 years from then. So it didn't work. So we proposed as a regulation a much faster implementation. And that had two effects. First of all, it got them very agitated and writing letters saying, no, we misinterpreted the law. But second of all, I learned early through that experience that every time we talked about it, we won. We taught people about the dangers of tobacco. We taught people about the dangers of fires. We collaborated with researchers who could then talk to the media about it. And there's so many different tools that epidemiology has when it's right, to use data to push back on some of the messages or the distortion. So it can be frustrating when you see people distorting data, and the tobacco industry, as you said, is the great example of that in so many different ways. But it can also be quite satisfying to succeed in the other direction, and the field of epidemiology has done that.
Good. Thanks. I think what we'll do is maybe go to Sharon next, because I think you presided over one great victory, and certainly interacted with epidemiologists and counter-epidemiologists a lot.
Okay. Well, first of all, you should know with the right shoes, you can do anything. And with the right epidemiologists on the stand, You pretty much control the discussion. John and I started working together in 1999 before we filed the lawsuit, and we went to trial in 2004 and 2005. I not only learned a lot about epidemiology during that time, but because we knew at the beginning that this was very, very important. But what was interesting to me to watch was the development over time of the causal links that actually existed. It wasn't like the law where maybe you push for a particular result and you get it. It was, what is the evidence? So, advocacy had nothing to do with it. So we're layering over in the lawsuit, which originally started out to shore up Medicare costs by getting from the tobacco industry the cost involved in return to the government, the cost involved in treating sick smokers. Because those parts or the statutes that addressed those types of claims were found not to be valid with respect to being able to proceed with the case, it was just one big, massive fraud case. So again, when we look at the fraud case and we look at what we're trying to demonstrate here, it's like some kind of Jedi mind trick the other side is doing. It's like, no, first they say, everybody knows smoking is harmful to your health. And then they challenge you every step of the way. Because in a courtroom, it's very different from academically how these things play out. For one thing, it's an adversary process. You don't get to just say, John, get on the stand and tell the judge everything. And by the way, it was a bench trial, not a jury trial, which was great for us because the judge kind of was immune to the Jedi mind trick stuff. And she actually read the evidence. We had a written direct exam, which meant, in large part, we wrote a question, John answered the question. So we controlled the discussion in that sense, but still it was kind of awkward in that it was by questions and answers, and it had to be at a level that laypersons could understand, basically taking us through the history of epidemiology and the history of epidemiology with respect to the adverse health effects of smoking. By the time when we first started our work in '99, we had a list from John of I guess you called it, causation has been determined with respect to these diseases and cigarette smoking playing a role or causing these diseases. This is done. And there were certain things that were not done, but 4 years later, or 5 years later, by the time we were in trial, the evidence was solid, and those causal relationships had also been developed. That was very interesting, for a lawyer like me to watch. But so much is artificial. You have this discovery process. There's all this gotcha going on. And then one of my favorite statements, which is I reread portions of your written direct testimony. And this was a question that we asked you at every turn of every, finding about disease. Can you state with a reasonable degree of scientific certainty? Cringeworthy, right, to you scientists out there? A reasonable degree of scientific certainty? Well, maybe it'll surprise you to know that really doesn't even have a meaning in the law, except it was something that had to be said. Also, there's a big difference in scientific proof and scientific evidence than the standard preponderance of the evidence that we had to demonstrate in a civil case. And that was something else that came into play. But the real stars in the courtroom were the epidemiologists on our side and the historians to take us through things and show us how we got where we were. It was, I'll leave it at that. I know that there are others here. And another lawyer, you notice he put us last.
This has nothing to do with discipline. Lawyers are paranoid, by the way.
He's right.
So let me turn to Yolanda, and I think with sort of a depth of expertise and experience nationally and internationally, and lots of struggles still going on worldwide.
Right. So not paranoid, I am last. So it's very interesting to hear you recount, John, the sort of history of the epidemiology here in the United States. And not unsurprising, most of you will know that what's happening and what's shifting in terms of where the tobacco industry is now setting its sights is very much globally. And it's very much in low and middle income countries. And if you think about that, it is searching for markets where the regulatory environment is much, much softer than is here. And also, the science is much softer. So not unsurprisingly, as we work globally, it turns out we have to relitigate a lot of the things that are already very much have been reached a point of proof here. Fortunately for the world, all the scientific data is now codified in the Framework Convention for Tobacco Control. It's the global treaty that actually sets the global standard for what should be done to address tobacco control. But nonetheless, though we have many, many, many countries who've signed the fastest growing treaty ever in the world, we still have to litigate some of the issues in the public sphere about what in fact is what the epidemiological and other data shows in terms of tobacco control. If I could just say, there is one story that I think you'll enjoy from India, but there are many others. So just a year ago, India decided that it wanted to increase its pack warning size. It had a pack warning size of only 20%, which is below the global bar. And so it decided with a very, very, very progressive health minister that it would increase its pack warnings. So he looked at the sort of global standings in terms of where India felt it was 126th on the list. And he decided he didn't want to be there. He actually wanted to be first. He was going to leapfrog over 126 countries and decided to put in place an edict that said the global health warning in the pack warning in India would now be 85%, which would have tied it for first place with Thailand. So he was very, very progressive. Little did he know the tobacco industry was not having that. So behind the scenes, it goes out. We're at the conference of the party for the Framework Convention. Everyone is really excited. India decides to leapfrog. It comes at this exciting moment. It takes 6 months to put the pack warning into effect. About 2 weeks before the pack warning was supposed to go in effect, with much fanfare that had happened all around the world, so, a committee on subordinated legislation, which most people, even lawyers in India, didn't even really know existed and certainly didn't realize had any regulatory oversight, decided that they wanted to look into the health effects of tobacco to justify the pack warnings. And sure enough, this huge sort of public debate got inflamed in India about whether, in fact, there was a causal link between tobacco and cancers. It was quite interesting to see this debate played out publicly in 2015, but yet there it was on the airways in India. And if you just want to entertain yourself, just Google that, and you will see the most incredible sort of coverage of this issue played out in 2015 in India. Fortunately, we litigated in a state court in India and forced the government to, in fact, put in place its pack warnings. It's now since issued a new an edict which allows it to put the pack warning in effect. It's supposed to go into effect in 2016. But stay tuned. I'm sure the tobacco industry has lots more tricks up its bag to prevent that one from going into effect in 2016 as well.
So you triggered the thought that during the summer I went to Korea. Our former postdoc here, Sunha Ji, who many of you know, is involved in tobacco litigation in Korea, where in a series of cases a couple of years ago, the court decided that nicotine was probably not addicting and that there are other causes of lung cancer besides smoking. So how would you ever know in a particular smoker if the cigarettes had actually figured in? And now the National Health Insurance System, which is a national insurance program, is litigating against the tobacco industry and facing exactly this same challenge. So the story lives on. So we have at least 10 minutes for comments and your questions. So I think there's microphones, or you can shout loudly or softly, and I'll repeat. So questions?
Hi, thank you so much for coming. This question is actually for the lawyers up there. So are there any areas of research that you think could be really improved in helping make counter-arguments in court?
Well, let me invite you to look at what has happened recently with respect to the FDA and some of the regulatory steps that they've taken and what the comeback is of the industry. I'm not actively engaged in tobacco litigation anymore, but I do think that maybe to put it over to the FDA, you might actually, even as a non-lawyer, be able to answer that question better. I don't know if Yolanda has an idea too.
Well, I would just say one thing. It obviously really depends on what the suit is that's before the court or whatever the deciding agency is. But right now there is pending before, John alluded to it in his talk, there's pending before what's called the International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes, a trade case by Uruguay. And one of the issues in that case is, as John mentioned, that Uruguay had decided to deal with the low and light tar issue, that it would in fact just eliminate all brands, brand variants. So a tobacco company could only have one brand. And the idea was, even once light and low was eliminated, the coloring gave hints, the packaging gave hints or whatever to allow people to perceive that there is lower harm. And one of the issues that was very much at the heart of the case was about whether or not there was really a basis, a scientific basis, for Uruguay to eliminate brand variants as a way to protect public health. The other issue was the question about whether or not the actual size of the warnings were something that could, in fact, be proven to have, at each level that you increase the size, each increment actually had a public health benefit. So we knew bigger was better, but we couldn't actually prove that each incremental improvement necessarily helped. So there's tons of things that, just in the evidentiary context come up, but it's hard to say just in a vacuum.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I can jump in. I'm not a lawyer, so keep that in mind. But for sure, the point that was made is that FDA's actions often result in subsequent litigation. So from our perspective, as scientists, our goal is to provide the strongest evidence base that we can, when supporting an action. So that's sort of the way we, we look at it and we approach it, and then sort of leave the other issues to the lawyers.
I would just throw in that I think if we had molecular signatures that increase certainty as to causation of cancers, probably in particular by tobacco, that would be valuable in terms of this question of individual causation, which is, there's always these counter arguments that there are multiple causes. So good. Other must be.
I see Professor Silberg out there.
Yeah, you just mentioned other causes, and could you talk a little bit about the epidemiological conundrum of people with asbestos exposure historically and smoking histories, and how that evolved?
So the question relates to the multiple causation problem, and probably one of the important examples is asbestos. The uranium mining populations, which I worked with, are another. I don't know whether Sharon or Yolanda would want to comment on this. There was actually litigation by the asbestos industry against tobacco on the grounds that they had been compensating for cases that were attributed to asbestos when, at the least, smoking had made a contribution. This is a complicated intersection of epidemiology and law. So, comments? That actually ended in a hung case. The case was dismissed. But.
Oh, well, then that's a great result. They always argued at least in our case, there were always confounders. And that was certainly, a major confounder. And we had models done, biostatistical models done that took into account other possible causes. And that's how we dealt with it. It wasn't just epidemiology, it was biostatistics as well. And we married those results and, made reports from that to take into account these things.
Yeah, I want to move on, but the other reference I would give you on this is to look at the handling of smoking in the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, in particular, where we address this issue. Let's see. Let me make sure I don't miss anybody. I know you have a question, and Ellen. And okay. So why don't you go ahead and then we'll go.
So this week there was the big news that they may be banning smoking in public assisted housing. I think that was talked about yesterday. And I wanted to ask the panel, what kind of challenges do you see with the implementation of this procedure if it does end up being approved as a formal procedure, and possible pushback from the industry?
Sure. So I was the health commissioner when the indoor smoking ban took effect for bars and restaurants in Baltimore. And, that may seem obvious to people that you don't smoke inside restaurants, but there were smoking sections in restaurants all the way until 2006 or 7 in Baltimore. And it was not a foregone conclusion that that would pass. And we heard every type of argument, this would be the end of the corner bar in Baltimore. I remember saying to someone, I didn't realize the corner bar was kind of like the family farm, but the turned out not to be the end of the corner bar. People, can live with it. And people said a lot. One of the biggest pushbacks we got was, how could you possibly enforce it? You don't have the staff, Josh, at the health department to be doing restaurant inspections all the time. And there's just so many. And it was like, we got like 2 complaints. People knew this was what they had to do, and they followed through, and it was just it was fine. It was really fine. And, even the businesses didn't want to go backwards. And because Baltimore voted for this, the state delegation flipped, and then the state became smoke-free. Baltimore led the state in doing it. And it was a tribute to all the people here and everybody who was engaged in that. I think that the enforcement issue, can be tricky sometimes, but generally you don't have to go in being so fearful. And a lot of public health, this is not like all the public housing developments, everybody's smoking all the time. It's a lot of them have already gone smoke-free, and it's been fine, and people like it, and their kids don't get asthma attacks. And I think that it needs to be handled while you set a social expectation. And then, we didn't feel like we had to people would say, well, what exactly is your plan? I was like, well, if somebody is allowing people to smoke in their restaurant, we'll go and figure out what's going on. We'll ask them what's happening. We'll give them a warning, and then we've got some enforcement if we really need to. But I always said I expect that everybody will follow the law, and across the city, that's what happened. So I'm less concerned about this. I think there's always a lot of hand-wringing when this comes up, but I don't think it'll be so bad.
Yeah, so maybe 2 anecdotes. I testified before the House Subcommittee on Aviation in 1987 on having an in-flight smoking ban, and it was said that it would never be possible because it could not be enforced. And is Anna Navas here somewhere? So it was you who took students out and measured particle levels in bars, and on the street, and then testified in city council and had a front page story in the Baltimore Sun that I think was useful evidence for Josh and the city as they faced this. So let me go on. I think Ellen, let's get a question in here.
Thanks, and I'll try to speak loudly. Everyone here raised an issue that has troubled me in other contexts, and that's this notion of you have to prove it happens here. So you may gather all this evidence from England, the United States, wherever else about direct smoking and secondhand smoking, but yet still it apparently is a cogent argument socially, certainly economically, I'm sure, and legally in other countries to say, well, you've got to prove it happens here. And I encountered it with lead when we were testifying in England about taking lead out of gasoline. And the chair of the committee, who was, I'm afraid, an epidemiologist, said, well, I think you have an unusual lead problem in the United States. I looked at it and said, it is because you hunt your food. This is a serious
Yeah.
issue. How can we have kind of a global synthesis when we have evidence on something, unless you have direct evidence that people who live in India have a totally different genome and therefore are resilient than myself?
So for those who didn't hear the question, it's an important issue. I think across many environmental exposures, in fact, which is when you have a broad body of scientific knowledge and understanding, but don't necessarily have local data. When do you need local data? And aside from convincing policymakers with the demonstration that, yes, lead is as bad in one national border as another, what do you do? Yolanda, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, one of my great joys in traveling internationally is that it affirms that every single people think of themselves as exceptional. So I just love it. Every time I go into country, it won't work here, no. These are all the different variants about why it won't help here. The only thing I can just say is the thing that really helps us globally is that, as I said, The consensus is codified in the Framework Convention that sets the global, that's where the global consensus lies. It's reflective of, studies from all around the world. But not only does it codify the consensus that tobacco is a problem, it also codifies the solutions that are needed in order to address it. So we kind of start from there, from a political argument, because most countries are signatories, and almost all countries, of course, except for us, are ratifiers of the convention. And so it just takes some of the political heat out of that argument, but it comes up every single time in every single situation.
I think that quote from Hill applies here. But of course, as you know, not having local evidence can be a reason to say, oh, we need to do more research, thereby delaying doing anything, of course. So that's a common tactic. So I'm afraid I think we're out of time. Is that officially what David says we are out of time? I want to thank the panel. I think we're all honored by being here at the 100th anniversary talk. Hopefully at the 200th anniversary, people will look back whimsically at the time when people smoked cigarettes. Let's hope that's the case, but certainly tobacco has been an important focus of the Department of Epidemiology and of the school, and I think the work has made a difference. I want to thank the panelists for coming. I think your perspectives have been great. I think they'll probably be here for a few minutes if anybody wants to have questions or comments. And again, thanks. It's been great.